Welcome to Jazz Piano Skills. I'm Dr. Bob Lawrence. It's time to discover, learn, and play jazz piano. We started September 2 weeks ago with an exploration of 5 primary sounds of E. E major, E dominant, E minor, E half diminished, and E diminished, using our 5 improvisation exercises for developing good jazz fingerings that help us develop hand mobility and, of course, a proper and authentic jazz articulation. And last week, we dove into the altered E dominant sounds, sharp 11, flat 13, flat 9, flat 13, and fully altered, using 5 improvisation exercises again to focus on developing hand mobility and articulation. So typically we would be jumping into a bebop tune to illuminate some classic jazz vocabulary that we could show off our new fingerings on, right? But I have made an executive decision today to push that episode to next week so that I could introduce you to Improvisation Grids, an approach I use to help students transition from a vertical melodic sound to a horizontal or linear sound. This is, without question, one of the most challenging skills to develop. And having a conceptual understanding and, of course, a physical command of improvisation grids will help you make this very significant leap to a professional sound when improvising. So today you are going to discover improvisation grids, and you are going to learn how to create an improvisation grid, and you're going to play an improvisation grid to improvise over an isolated sound, a 2-5-1 progression, and a classic jazz standard. So as I always like to say, regardless of where you are in your jazz journey, a beginner, an intermediate player, an advanced player, or even if you're a seasoned and experienced professional, you're going to find this Jazz Piano Skills podcast lesson exploring improvisation grids to be very beneficial. But before we dig in, I want to, as I always do, welcome new listeners to the Jazz Piano Skills podcast. And if you are a new listener, if you're new to Jazz Piano Skills, I want to invite you to become a Jazz Piano Skills member. There are various membership plans to choose from. So when you have a moment, check out jazzpianoskills.com to learn more about each of the membership plans and the perks associated with each plan. There are educational weekly podcasts, which include illustrations, lead sheets, and play-alongs that are developed and available for every weekly podcast episode. There's also an online sequential jazz piano curriculum, which is loaded with comprehensive courses. There's an online weekly masterclass, online interactive fake book, and a private jazz piano skills community, which hosts a variety of engaging forums. On top of all that, there's also unlimited private, personal, and professional educational support that's available. All of these perks, all of them are waiting for you, wanting to help you discover, learn, and play jazz piano. So again, when you have a moment, check out jazzpianoskills.com and, of course, become a member. Once you're there, if you have any questions regarding the various membership plans or any of the perks, please do not hesitate to contact me. I'm always happy to spend a little time with you, answer any questions that you may have, and help you in any way that I can. Okay. So now, we typically have the question of the week, but today, simply due to the incredible amount of material that I am hoping to present, explain, and model for you, all within an hour, it's going to be a sprint. So we're not going to have the typical question of the week. That will return next week. Okay? So now let's get busy and let's talk about these improvisation grids. I believe that the most common approach for teaching someone to begin improvising, and for good reason, is to begin with a harmonic approach. In other words, we begin with creating melodies using the notes of the chord that we are confronted with, right? This makes perfect sense. If I have to play or improvise something over a C dominant 7, I'm going to use the notes C, E, G, and B flat to create some melodic idea, right? It's clean, it's tidy. And guess what? It's also historical. If you go back to listen to solos of early jazz musicians in the 1900s, early 1900s, you will notice a very clear harmonic approach to improvisation. So the development of jazz itself, history, tells us that this is a very good approach to use for beginning to develop improvisational skills. But history also tells us that jazz musicians and their improvisation approaches evolved, and they began using scale tones and non-scale tones in addition to the chord tones, and did so in such a way that their melodies, their improvisation, became free in a sense, that their playing moved from a vertical approach to a horizontal or a linear approach, right? From a vertical sound to a horizontal sound. Well, herein lies the challenge for all of us wanting to develop mature or professional improvisational skills. How can I take my vertical improvisation melodies, which is exactly how I have been taught to think about improvisation, and break out of that mindset? I want to begin playing musical phrases that stretch over many chords and many measures, just like I hear professional jazz musicians do. But how do I develop that skill? Well, I believe the answer is improvisation grids. So, the educational agenda for today is as follows. Number 1, we will explore an improvisation grid. Number 2, we will apply the improvisation grid to an isolated minor sound. Number 3, we will apply the improvisation grid to a 2-5-1 progression. And number 4, we will apply the improvisation grid to a jazz standard, a classic. There will never be another you. One final but significant note, though, before we jump in and explore these grids. If you think that the improvisation grid approach that we are about to discover, learn, and play is over your head, then I would say to you, relax. Right? Breathe in, breathe out. No worries, right? Continue to listen and grow your jazz piano skills intellectually by doing just that, by just simply listening to this podcast episode. Every new skill is over our heads when first introduced. But this is how we get better, right? We place ourselves right in the middle of conversations where we are hearing things that we've never heard before, hearing words that we've never heard before. Therefore, we are forced, literally, we're forced to grow intellectually. And I say it all the time, all musical growth begins upstairs, mentally, conceptually, before it can come out downstairs, physically, in your hands. So what I want you to do is just simply sit back, relax, listen to this podcast lesson now to discover and learn. The play, as it always does, it comes in time. I guarantee it. Okay, so what is an improvisation grid? An improvisation grid is an interval. That's what it is, right? It's an interval. It's 2 notes, some distance apart, whether that be a third or a fifth, a seventh, a ninth, or a 13th, right? And then within that interval, we have designated landmarks. So the improvisation grid that I want to begin with is the largest improvisation grid. So I want to introduce a grid that spans the distance of a 13th. So I want you to think right now F minor, okay? And the F minor sound consists of 7 notes: F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D, and E flat, okay? And I just played that sound. I just played that F minor sound using scale motion. But I could also play that F minor sound using arpeggio motion, where I'm going to go root, third, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, right? So I either have scale motion or I have arpeggio motion. Okay, so we're going to use the arpeggio motion as our grid. So I want you to think of F minor, this grid spanning the distance of a 13th from the note F to the note D. Again, the distance of a 13th. And each of the notes in between that F and that D, the A flat, C, E flat, G, and B flat, those are our landmarks, okay? So let's, for a lack of a better label, we're just going to call this an F minor grid. But really, it's a grid that consists of starting on the note F, going to the note D, a 13th away, okay? But let's label it the F minor grid. So what I want to do is I want to demonstrate improvising over this isolated sound using either scale motion or arpeggio motion between the root and the 13th. So I want to bring the ensemble in. I just want to start by exploring this grid, this F minor sound from the root to the 13th, and freely improvising using scale and arpeggio motion between the F and the D, a 13th apart. So let's start with that. So here's the ensemble. Let's play this F minor grid. I'm going to play it at a tempo of 140 today for just the sake of demonstration. But if you practice this at home, again, as I always recommend, nice, comfortable tempos, slower tempos, tempos that will allow you to succeed and that you can manage easily to start. Okay? So here we go. Let's check out the F minor grid, root to 13th. Here we go. Okay, right? Pretty straightforward stuff there. Nothing too alarming, right? But now we can take that same grid, but let's shrink our grid. Instead of giving us the distance of a 13th from the root to the 13th, now let's take our grid, that F minor sound, and let's take it only to the 9th. So we have our F minor scale representing the 9th. to the ninth, or our arpeggio to the ninth. Again, scale to the ninth, arpeggio to the ninth. So now my playground gets a little smaller, right? So I want to bring the ensemble back in, and now I'm going to use that as my grid, this distance of a ninth. And I'm going to improvise freely within that ninth using either scale motion or arpeggio motion. Okay? So let's bring the ensemble in and let's check out how this sounds. And again, I'm going to be playing 140, tempo of 140. So here we go. Check it out. Very nice, right? Very cool, but nothing very shocking, nothing very alarming here, right? We have our grid. We've just shrunk it from the 13th to the 9th. Now we're going to actually shrink our grid again, and this time it's going to be from the root to the 5th. Root to the 5th. So now my F minor sound using scale motion is this. Root to the 5th, or my arpeggio. That's it, right? So again, the playground just keeps getting smaller. And there's a reason for this. And you'll see that reason unfold as this episode continues. So let's bring the ensemble in. Now I'm going to have to improvise over this F minor sound using a very small grid, root to 5th. But I still have scale motion to explore and arpeggio motion to explore when improvising. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's listen to this grid of a 5th as I improvise using scale and arpeggio motion over the F minor sound. Here we go. Check it out. So we have established this grid using the F minor sound as our template, if you will. And we've looked at a grid in its entirety from the root to the 13th of the F minor sound. We then shrunk that grid to the 9th, and then we shrunk the grid again to the 5th, right? Regardless of the size of the grid, the 13th, the 9th, or the 5th, we realize that we have scale and arpeggio motion that exist inside that grid. Okay? So now let's make it a little more interesting. Let's look at the 2-5-1 progression. And of course, let's look at it, the 2-5-1 progression, in relationship to the key of E flat major. Since we started with the F minor as our grid template, let's imply the 2 chord, the F minor as the 2 chord, going to the 5 chord, which would be B flat dominant 7, resolving to the 1 chord, E flat major 7. Okay, but we're going to use the 3 grids that we just set up, right? With the isolated F minor sound, grid 1 being root to 13th, grid 2 root to 9, grid 3 root to 5. We're going to use those 3 templates and apply those 3 templates to our 2-5-1 progression. So this is where it gets interesting, right? So if I have my F minor sound, my F minor grid from the root to the 13th, right? I'm going to still think that grid over the entire 2-5-1 progression. So I get 2, 5, 1. Okay? Now, let me share with you the logic behind this. This grid, F to D, the 13th, distance of a 13th, that would be, I can look at that grid and say, yes, that is clearly F minor from the root to the 13th. But I can also look at that same grid and say that's B flat dominant 7 from the 5th to the 3rd. Same 7 notes. And I can also look at that exact same grid from the F to the D and say, well, that's E flat major 7 from the 9th or the 2nd to the 7th to the D. Same 7 notes. So again, we have our 2, we have our 5, and we have our 1. So because I see that grid as being 100% applicable to the minor chord, the 2 chord, 100% applicable to the 5 chord, the B flat 7, and 100% applicable to the 1 chord, the E flat major 7. Now I am freed up to create, to improvise, to focus on playing within that grid over the 2-5-1 progression, as opposed to thinking 2 chord, play something, 5 chord, play something, 1 chord, play something, which lends itself to a very vertical sound, which we're trying to break away from. And the grid will help us do just that. So what I want to do, I want to model for you, I want to bring the ensemble back in, and I want to play the 2-5-1 progression now in the key of E flat, and I'm going to use my grid from the root to the 13th. So I'm going to start with my largest playground as I play over my 2-5-1, but I'm going to stay within the grid, and of course I can use scale motion, I can use arpeggio motion. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to play the 2-5-1 progression. You're going to hear me play the arpeggio from the root to the 13th. You're going to hear me play the scale from the root to the 13th. Then you're going to hear me start to improvise within that grid over the top of my 2-5-1, because I want to focus on linear development in my playing, breaking away from a vertical mindset. If I have a 2, play something, a 5, play something, a 1, play something. Okay? So let's bring the ensemble in and let's check it out. Here we go. It's getting interesting, right? This is something to think about. Playing that same grid, working off that same grid over the top of the entire 2-5-1 progression. I don't know about you, but that's much more intriguing from a creative standpoint than always constantly having to shift my thought process from a 2-chord to a 5-chord to a 1-chord. I'm quite aware of the 2-5-1 moving underneath me, but I am working over the top of that 2-5-1 using my grid. Now, if I shrink the grid to the 9th, okay, so now my playground just gets smaller. But within that smaller playground, I should be able to create, improvise very easily through my 2-5-1 progression. I might just have to be a little bit more creative because my playground again is smaller, but it's all there. The 2-chord is there, the 5-chord is there, and the 1-chord is there within my grid to the 9th. So I have my F minor sound going to the 9th using scale motion, and I have my minor sound going to the 9th using arpeggio motion. I have my dominant chord, the distance of a 9th using scale motion. Also arpeggio motion. And I have my 1 chord going to distance of a 9th and using arpeggio motion. Right? It's all there. So now let me bring the ensemble in. And let's check out the 2-5-1 progression in E flat using my grid based off the F minor sound, the distance of a 9th. Okay? Here we go. Check it out. Very nice, right? Again, the playground got smaller. However, the minor sound is clearly within that grid. The dominant sound is in that grid. And the major sound is within that grid. Okay? So now, guess what? Let's shrink the grid again. So now let's take our grid to the 5th. So we have a minor, our F minor sound is going to go from our F to our C, or arpeggio motion. Our dominant sound from F to C. Our major sound, F to C. Okay, again, it's all there. The minor sound is there, the dominant sound is there, the major sound is there within that very small grid. So I want to bring the ensemble back in. Now I have to improvise within a much smaller playground, but I still have scale motion at my fingertips. I still have arpeggio motion at my fingertips to use to create. All right, so let's bring the ensemble in and let's check it out. Here we go. Okay, so pretty cool, right? We started with an isolated minor sound, and we established 3 different grids. A grid from the root to the 13th of that minor sound. We did a grid from the root to the 9th of that minor sound, and a grid from the root to the 5th. And we explored improvising within each of those grids using scale and arpeggio motion, which, by the way, it's the only 2 types of motion we have in music. So we're doing everything we possibly can. So then we said, okay, well, let's take that grid and can we use that same grid approach, those 3 grids, and can we think within those 3 grids as a 2-5-1 progression is playing? And so we logically said, well, okay, let's treat that minor grid then as the 2 chord, so therefore we would be in the key of E flat with our F minor 7 going to B flat 7 going to E flat major. And sure enough, we took those 3 grids and no difficulty, no problem, using that grid to freely improvise over our 2-5-1 progression, helping us develop linear lines, kind of breaking away from the vertical approach that we are typically taught when beginning to improvise, where we have a chord and we use the chord tones up and down to create some kind of melodic idea. And then we go to the next chord and we think about that chord and play something. And then we go to the next chord and we do the same thing, right? Again, a very vertical approach. How do we get from a vertical approach to improvisation to a much more linear approach? Well, these grids are helping us do that. So we went from an isolated minor sound to a 2-5-1 progression. Now let's take that grid and let's apply it to a classic standard. So I selected There Will Never Be Another You, which is a fabulous tune. The standard key for There Will Never Be Another You is the key of E flat. We just got done playing 2-5-1 in the key of E flat. So now I want to take my 3 grids that we established from using an isolated minor sound, and I want to see if I can take that grid, those 3 grids, and apply that grid to the standard There Will Never Be Another You. So the challenge here is that all the chord changes that exist within the standard There Will Never Be Another You, I have to be able to see them within my grid. Okay? The grid is what's going to hold my improvisation together, but I'm going to see those chord changes within that grid. So I'm going to start with the easiest grid, which ironically is the biggest grid from the root to the 13th, right? So let's bring the ensemble in. I'm going to play through There Will Never Be Another You. I'm going to do this at a tempo of 160, which is pretty much a standard tempo for this tune. And I'm going to play the head, and then I will improvise using my grid, and then I will play the head again and end the tune, okay? And when I'm playing within the grid, I'm going to stick with scale and arpeggio motion within the grid based upon the chord changes that I'm confronted with, found within the standard There Will Never Be Another You. Okay, so let's bring the ensemble in and let's see how this grid, improvising within this grid, works over this standard. All right, let's check it out. Here we go. It works. It works provided that you know your scales, your chord scale relationships. But it definitely works, right? And I'm freed up to think very linearly within that grid as opposed to thinking vertical, right? Okay, so now let's make it a little more challenging. Let's shrink the grid as we've been doing throughout this episode, throughout this podcast, right? So now instead of a playground that runs the distance, the interval of a 13th, let's shrink it down to the distance of a 9th. So now I have to see all those chords, the scales and the arpeggios for each of those chords within that grid, that smaller grid. But guess what? They're all there. All the scales, all the arpeggios for all the chords found in There Will Never Be Another You are within the grid running a distance of a 9th, F, A flat, C, E flat, and G. They're all there. Okay? So let's bring the ensemble in. I'm going to play this standard again. I'll play the head, improvise using my grid of a 9th, and then play the head again in the tune. So let's have some fun with There Will Never Be Another You using a grid of a 9th. Here we go. I love it. I love it. In fact, the smaller the grids, I think the better. It challenges you to really see the scales and the arpeggios for each of those chords within a specific geographical region. Okay? So let's continue that thought just a little further, right? Now let's shrink our grid to a fifth. So now I have F to C scale, F to C arpeggio, and can I see within that grid of a fifth, can I see all of the scales and all of the arpeggios for the chord changes of There Will Never Be Another You? Guess what? They're all there. They are all there within that fifth, right? You have to know the scales well enough that you can see the fragments of those scales found within the tune, within that grid, within that interval. Okay? So let's see if I can do that. This is a challenge, right? To be creative within that small playground, right? Using scale and arpeggio motion and finding the fragments that fit within that playground that coincide with the chord changes found within There Will Never Be Another You. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's do this one more time. Here we go. Wow. Right? So now, hopefully, this makes sense to you. Why improvisation grids are so very important. The grids, honestly, can be any distance between any two notes. I happen to use, and students always ask me, why did you pick the minor sound to produce your grid? And the answer is quite simply, well, it's the first chord of the 2-5-1 progression. And I practice my improvisation using these grids first and foremost over 2-5-1s. So because it was the first sound, I use that to base my grid off of. But you can create a grid off of the dominant sound if you wish, or off the major sound if you wish. I would just encourage you to do it, to develop your grids in such a way that it makes sense to you conceptually, it makes sense to you visually, and it makes sense to you physically. Okay? And if you do that, and if you can see your chords and the scales and the arpeggios for the chords within your grids, whether they be the distance of a 13th or a 9th or a 5th or even a 3rd, right? Then you are well on your way to establishing a very linear sound to your improvisation, to your playing. Wow. We've done it again, right? We've unpacked a ton of information in a very short and very fast hour, as always. Improvisation grids, right? It's time to begin developing improvisational lines, melodies that are linear, right? Time is always present when you're playing. Time is always present. But our creativity is dependent upon our ability to play through the bar lines as if they are not there at all. And likewise, our creativity is dependent upon our ability to be aware of key centers, like 2-5-1s, key centers, and chord changes, but not play as if we are chained to them. In other words, we want to play over them, not in them. I hope that makes sense. And if you conceptually understand this, then you are on the right track to developing a mature and professional jazz improvisation approach. As always, though, especially with improvisation grids, as always, be patient, right? Developing mature and professional jazz piano skills takes time. It takes a lifetime. So begin structuring your improvisation development after the playing demonstrations that I modeled for you in this podcast episode, and I guarantee it, you will begin to see, feel, and hear your progress. Okay, so next week we will tackle a tune and see if we can pull this entire month together, right? Our primary E sounds, our altered E dominant sounds, our improvisation grids, and of course the bebop tune of the month. Wow, next week should be a very exciting episode. Well, I hope you found this episode of the Jazz Piano Skills Podcast, Exploring Improvisation Grids. I hope you found it to be insightful and, of course, to be beneficial. And don't forget, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills Ensemble member, I'll see you online Thursday evening at the Jazz Piano Skills Masterclass. That's going to be 8 p.m. Central Time to discuss this podcast episode, exploring improvisation grids in greater detail, and, of course, to answer any questions that you may have about the study of jazz in general. You can, as always, reach me by phone, 972-380-8050. My office extension is 211. If you prefer email, Dr. Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence at jazzpianoskills.com, or you can use the nifty little SpeakPipe widget that is found, I believe, on every single page of the Jazz Piano Skills website. Well, there's my cue. That's it for now. And until next week, enjoy exploring improvisation grids, and most of all, have fun as you discover, learn, and play jazz piano.